Dr. Aubrey de Grey is the biomedical gerontologist who researched the idea for and founded SENS Research Foundation. He received his BA in computer science and a PhD in biology from the University of Cambridge in 1985 and 2000, respectively. Dr. de Grey is editor-in-chief of Rejuvenation Research and is a fellow of both the Gerontological Society of America and the American Aging Association. And you too can achieve great things like this if you have the dedication and patience to grow a killer beard. I do want to point out that Dr. de Grey shares that in common with my favorite theologian, John Calvin. So welcome, Dr. de Grey.
All right. That was a splendid introduction. Thank you so much. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Micah, and everyone on the team for having me along. Thank you especially for giving me a whole hour, because what I'll do with that is I will, first of all, give a fairly brief, maybe less than half an hour anyway, review of the science that we do at SENS Research Foundation and that we support at other places. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my time discussing, and of course also discussing with you in a bidirectional way, the questions that I think are most relevant to you. Most of that will revolve around advocacy. I will definitely want to explore with you the ways in which we might be able to hasten the defeat of aging by making more use, by mobilizing the Christian community, and in fact the community of other faiths as well, because I think there's plenty of potential there. I do know that a number of you are pretty familiar with my work already and with the ideas that we pursue, but I hope I'll introduce at least a few ideas that will be new on the science side. However, I do know that lots of you are completely new to this, so I will spend a fair amount of... There's somehow suddenly a lot of echo. Where did that come from? All right, I'm sure you can figure it out. I know that a lot of you are completely new to this, so I will do some reasonably introductory overview as well. All right, so, where do I start? I think where I'm going to start is something that rather surprised me when I was reading about the CTA, which is that we're out there, fighting a bunch of things, like, hunger and oppression and so on, and then there's death in there. And I thought, well, hang on, there's something wrong here. I didn't know that Christians were not in favor of death. But of course, the last session was quite illuminating in that regard, because I think if I remember the right form of words that was used, there's this question about whether one's talking about overcoming death through the afterlife or resurrection or whatever, versus not having death in the first place. And these are two different uses of the same term. And I'm actually going to talk quite a bit about the use of terminology that can be interpreted in different ways, because we've really got to get away from those kinds of terminology. If you want to try to persuade somebody of something, the very last thing that you want to do is use terminology that they can choose to understand in the way that they would like, So we'll come back to that. But I'm going to start by actually telling you about myself a little bit in one particular way. And this is for two reasons. So the thing I'm going to tell you is I consider myself to be agnostic. Now, why am I telling you that? Two reasons. First of all, full disclosure. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, the thing I want to tell you is how I got that way, because it leads into the philosophy that also led me to the insights that have underpinned my work on the biology of aging. I got that way because when I was, before I was a teenager anyway, certainly in my relatively early childhood, I came to the pretty firm conclusion that what I wanted to do with my life was make a difference. Well, I wanted to, do stuff that would improve the quality of life of humanity one way or another. And I wanted to do that on a big scale, and that's how I eventually decided to go into science. And then the first thing I did was I went into computer science because I found that I was a good programmer, and I worked in artificial intelligence research for a while because I thought, well, work, that's a problem, the fact that people have to spend so much of their time doing stuff that they wouldn't do unless they were being paid for it. And so we need to fix that, really. And it was only after I discovered that that so few people were working on aging, which is obviously an even more serious problem. When I say obviously, what I mean is to you guys it's obvious. Then I switched fields. But yeah, so I've been in that kind of frame of mind since my very earliest years, really, since certainly the age of like 10. And when I was a teenager, I was confused, as most teenagers are, about whether God exists or not, little things like that. And eventually it dawned on me that it didn't matter, because I was already choosing, for other reasons, to do exactly the same thing with my life that I would choose to do if I were basing my choice on the fact that I believed in God. In other words, I was already choosing to minimize the suffering of humanity and all that, to do God's work. So whether or not I actually had which way I sat on the does God exist spectrum didn't actually change how I was going to run my life. Now, why do I mention that? Because this is an example of what I like to call sidestepping one's ignorance. If you can figure out that there is no reason to know a particular thing, then you can get on with your life, right? And so that's what I do. And it's what I've done in science as well, as you will see. So let's start with a question. Why is it that we have been so spectacularly unsuccessful with the diseases and disabilities of old age, the ill health associated with old age, as compared to our success against infections? I mean, of course, there are still some infections that we still have a bit of a problem with, but the vast majority of the things that used to kill people early in life a couple of hundred years ago are gone. They're basically just gone. Even in the developing world, they're fairly gone. So, what gives? Why are the aspects of ill health in old age so different, much harder for medicine to get its head around? It's a question that people don't ask enough. Now, most people would say it's this. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. Most people would say it's simply that there's so much that happens, so many different things that go wrong late in life. And of course they go wrong at more or less the same time, which means that they exacerbate each other, they interact. So most people would say it's the sheer complexity of the problem that has overwhelmed the cleverness of medical research, and that's why we still have all these problems late in life. And that is part of the answer, for sure. I'm certainly not saying it's not part of the answer, but it's not the main answer. So I'm going to tell you what the main answer is. And I'm going to start, in order to explain what the answer is, by telling you what aging is, which is a crazy thing to have to tell you. But the fact is, if you ask 10 biologists, well, no, never mind normal people, if you ask 10 biologists the definition of aging, you'll get 10 different answers, if not 11. And that's not good, right? I mean, you kind of think we would have figured this out by now, but people have different ideas of what aging is. So I'm going to give you a simple definition. And I'm going to give you a definition in particular that demystifies aging, that emphasizes how aging is not some kind of enigma. It's something that we do actually understand really pretty well already. Aging is simply the accumulation throughout life of self-inflicted damage. The human body is a machine. Whether the human being is a machine, I'm not getting into, I don't need to. The human body undoubtedly is a machine, and it is, of course, a very, very complicated machine, but because it's a machine, its function is determined by its structure. And another feature of being a machine is that, like any machine with moving parts, it damages itself as a consequence, as an ongoing consequence of its normal operation. So just as a car accumulates rust and other stuff, throughout its normal life, similarly the human body, even starting before we're born, accumulates damage. It accumulates various changes to the molecular and cellular structure that we're made of, and those changes are progressive. Now, that's what I'm calling damage, and the reason I'm calling it damage is because even though it's harmless for a while, there is a threshold amount of that damage above which it's not harmless, above which it causes pathologies late in life. It causes things to go wrong because the body is simply only set up to tolerate a certain amount of this progressive change from the state that the body was in originally. That's all that aging is, the accumulation throughout life of self-inflicted damage. So in other words, it's exactly the same thing as the aging of a car or an aeroplane or any other inanimate object. Now, unfortunately, we haven't been terribly smart about how to address that. The overwhelming majority of the medical effort that goes into addressing the pathologies of old age is what I'm calling here geriatric medicine, directly attacking those pathologies. And that kind of is what you'd expect to do to eliminate the pathology from the body if the pathologies of old age were basically like infections. It's worked with infections. That's how we have succeeded in nobody dying of diphtheria and tuberculosis and so on anymore. But it hasn't worked in the case of the biology of aging. Why not? This is why not. Or rather, this is why we have persisted in making the mistake for so long. Here's the answer that most people would give to the question, give me a taxonomy of sickness. Tell me in what ways people can be sick. Most people would say, if you ask them that question, they would say, well, okay, there's infections, that's column 1. Communicable diseases. Then there's genetic diseases, column 2, the things that a few of us are unlucky enough to inherit. Then there's the big ones, the chronic progressive diseases of old age, like Alzheimer's and most cancers and so on. And then, in most people's minds, there's this fourth category way out in the stratosphere called aging itself, which is completely and utterly unlike disease, and it's natural and it's inevitable and it's kind of almost off limits for medicine. That's the way that most people intuitively think. And that is why we have persisted in trying to attack the so-called diseases of old age, which is basically column 3, as if they were rather like column 1. But they're not. If we go back to what I just said, aging is the lifelong accumulation of damage that occurs as an intrinsic side effect of the body's normal operation. We're set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage, but only a certain amount, so late in life, things go bad. It ultimately comes down to the top line I've got on this slide, the fact that aging is a consequence of physics, not biology. There are some things like, for example, consciousness, which are emergent phenomena of biology. We can fairly definitely say that cars are not conscious. But aging is not one of those things. Aging is not an emergent phenomenon of biology. It's just the same as it is in a car. Now, what that means is that this is the right version of the table I showed you earlier. All the columns are the same as they were a moment ago, but the big, thick black line is in a different place. And that is critical. What that is trying to emphasize is two things. Number one, it emphasizes that actually the things in column 3 are nothing like the things in column 1. And we should not expect to be able to attack them and address them and ameliorate them by the same kinds of methods that have worked for column 1. That is the big mistake of geriatric medicine. The other thing, however, that we are emphasizing by putting the black line in the right place is that the column 3 are pretty much identical to the things in column 4. In fact, I would go so far as to say that they're indistinguishable from a biological perspective. The only difference between column 3 and column 4 is semantic. That column 3 is the aspects of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to, and the ones in column 4 are the ones we haven't. And that is critically important, because it completely abolishes this putative distinction between the so-called diseases of old age and the things called aging itself. There is no difference. People often say that I call aging a disease, that I think aging is a disease. That's nonsense. I think that actually this is one example of a word that is misused in an ambiguous way where people, will hear what they want to hear. The word disease should not be broadened in the way that it's used to include aging. It should be narrowed. It should not be used to include these so-called diseases of old age, like Alzheimer's, because those things are nothing like the things that are rightly called diseases, like infections. So I'm not the first person to kind of realize a lot of this. Maybe I say it in slightly more strident language, but the fact is, for a century or more, there have been people who have realized that geriatric medicine is just never going to work, that it's just the wrong approach. We need to be more preventative about the problems of aging and get in an earlier point of the chain of events. And that's where the whole field of gerontology came from. Well, look, we've got to be more preventative. But hey, maybe we can be, because if we look at the living world, we see this huge variation in the rate of aging. Some species live a lot longer than others, and they age a lot more slowly than others. Even within a species, you've got, quite a variation, a modest variation at least, between individuals, and that's wonderful. So maybe we can study this, and maybe we can get to a point of really understanding the basis for that. You're going to get a different microphone? Yeah, sure. What's going on? I don't know what you're doing, but you can do it.
Give me just
all right. You're going to turn something on? This is definitely not working now. It's definitely not working. Better? No, I can't hear myself. All right, I'm going to wait until he's got it figured out. I'm just going to carry on saying completely meaningless, semantically pointless stuff until, just as a kind of sound check. Media people tend to ask you what you had for breakfast when they want to do a sound check, and it's really difficult for me because, here we go, I don't actually eat breakfast. But anyway. Right, so here we go. So there's this variation between different individuals in terms of rate of aging. So maybe if we study this really, really hard, we might be able to figure out the basis for it, and we might be able to translate that understanding into some kind of therapy, some kind of therapeutic regimen. Nice idea in principle. Completely unsuccessful, every bit as unsuccessful as geriatrics has been. This is why. Metabolism is a little complicated, really. Hands up anyone here who writes software. All right, quite a few of you, yeah. So anyone here will immediately recognize that this is the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code, right? This is just like, there is no way in hell that you're ever going to be able to tweak this network in order to, stop it from doing the thing you don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without at the same time having unintended consequences that stop it from doing things you need it to do to keep us alive, right? And of course, that's a gross understatement of the real problem. The real problem is not just that this is a diagram of, how the body works. It's actually a really simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. And, of course, even that is an understatement, because actually it's a simplified diagram of a really small subset of what we know about how the body works, which is completely dwarfed by what we don't know. Waste of time, never going to work. And of course, it took a while, but eventually gerontologists began to realize this. By the 1960s, 1970s, people had pretty much given up on the idea. If you wrote a grant application, you could not mention intervention at all. Gerontology had become a bit like seismology. Seismologists, they understand that the thing they study is bad for you, but they have no aspiration at all to doing anything about it. It's just a matter of, get out of the way. But here's the thing. That's not the end of the story. It turns out there's a third approach to defeating aging. And this is, it's fairly shocking that it took until I came along for anybody to really kind of notice this. Perhaps I benefited from switching fields. I'm sure you all know that switching fields has a long track record of being a good thing for researchers to do. But yeah, I mean, the fact is my definition of aging, which is not something new, I mean, I say it in more concise language perhaps, but it's certainly not something that anyone would have disputed even 50 years ago. My definition of aging splits aging into two processes. The process throughout life where our metabolism generates damage, and the process late in life where that damage, having reached a particular level of abundance, generates pathology. Now, what I've shown you so far is that the idea of somehow breaking the right hand of those processes, the damage to pathology one, is a non-starter. And I've also shown you that breaking the left-hand one from metabolism to damage is a non-starter. But in order to break the overall process, we don't actually need to break either of the component processes. What we can do instead is uncouple them from each other. And that's what the maintenance approach is. Maintenance simply means damage repair. It means going in and periodically eliminating some proportion of the damage that the body has done to itself before the damage gets to a point that is pathogenic, but only when there is some damage, not preventing the damage from being generated in the first place. And this comes back to what I said at the beginning about being an agnostic and about sidestepping ignorance. If you look at what I'm doing here, I'm saying that we can let metabolism generate damage at the normal rate, and we can get away with it. And because we can let it generate damage at the normal rate, we don't need to understand how it generates damage. We don't need to know any more than we already do about the detailed processes of metabolism that create all that damage in the first place. We also don't need to know, on the right-hand side, the details of why a certain amount of damage is bad for us, because we're not going to let that amount of damage be present in the first place. So we are sidestepping two hugely complex areas of our ignorance, metabolism and pathology. Fantastic. This is what any engineer ought to be looking for all the time. And indeed, the fundamental reason, I believe, why gerontologists didn't work this out for themselves before I had to come along is that they're not engineers, they're not technologists. I never understood this, but it's very clear to me now that the mindset of a basic scientist whose job it is to understand nature is completely different from the mindset of a technologist whose job is to manipulate nature. These two things sound as though they ought to be very similar, but they just aren't. All right, so that is the maintenance approach. And as I say, it's fundamentally common sense. Why do I say it's common sense? Here's why. Remember what I said about aging being basically the same as it is in cars? Here's a car. This car is more than 100 years old, and it's doing every bit as well as when it was built. But the key thing to emphasize, that I must emphasize, is that the reason it's doing so well is not because it was built that way. It was not designed to live this long. The only reason why Henry Ford made so much money out of planned obsolescence is because most of us are lazy. We don't give a damn about our cars. We're perfectly happy to let them to do only the amount of maintenance on them that the law requires, and then, they fall apart and you get a new one. These people are crazy, and they chose to do a lot more work on their car than that, and this is the result. It works. Preventative maintenance works. So you may have noticed that there's a little bit of detail that I have elided so far. I've told you that this maintenance approach sidesteps the complexity of metabolism, yes, and it sidesteps the comparable, equally daunting complexity of pathology, yes, but I haven't talked yet about the complexity of this thing called damage in the middle. I've just used this one word, as a kind of marker for the thing that we're actually going to attack. And of course, that is something whose complexity, such as it may be, we have absolutely not sidestepped. So the question is, what is the nature of that complexity? And the good news is, it's not too bad. It's not good, but it's not too bad. The short answer is that every single type of molecular or cellular change in the body that happens throughout life that qualifies as damage in the sense that there's reason to believe that it eventually contributes to the pathology of old age. Every single one of them can be classified into one of just 7 major categories, which I'm giving you on the left-hand side of this table. These categories are, as you can see, well-defined biological phenomena. So cell loss, what's that? That's simply cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. That's all it is, okay? And it sounds like a rather abstract, rather broad category. Is that a useful category to have? Well, yes, it is. Of course, there are many different types of cell in the body. A lot of them die. A lot of those ones that do die are replaced, but some of them are not. So cell loss happens in various places around the body with age. Why is that a useful category? The answer is what's on the right-hand side. Even though there are lots of different cell types that die and are not replaced, the solution for repairing that is to put cells back. That's all it is. And how do we do that? We do stem cell therapy, of course. Stem cell therapy is all about programming cells in the lab into the right state so that you can inject them into the body and they will divide and transform themselves into replacements for the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. And, of course, different stem cell therapies for different tissues are not identical, but they are rather close to identical. All stem cell therapies have a great deal in common, which means that this classification is useful. It means that once you've got one stem cell therapy working, getting the second one and the third one working is going to be a hell of a lot easier than the first one. And that's the same right down the list. The reason Sense Research Foundation had to exist is because, unlike stem cell therapy, the rest of these types of damage do not have a corresponding type of repair approach, intervention, that is already well established in the medical research arena. So we had to essentially develop them from scratch. Not completely from scratch. I wouldn't have been able to write the right-hand side of this table unless I knew how to fill it in, right? But actually, a large part of why I took quite a few years to bring my colleagues in gerontology on side with regard to the plausibility and feasibility of all of this is because most of the technologies that I proposed, which are listed on the right-hand side, are actually ones that they didn't know about. They were ones that had been developed for other reasons, by other types of biologists, in some cases not even by medical biologists, by people who, so in the case of this one here, people working in environmental decontamination, completely different area. And, things that gerontologists felt were kind of not their problem. Took a while to educate them out of that, but we're there now. So here's a bunch of the things that we've been doing over the years. This is just a selection of some of the more high-profile papers we've published lately. And I'm pleased to say that most of these papers, most of these breakthroughs, have actually not just led to nice high-profile publications, but actually to spin-out companies. Our business model, basically, we're a non-profit Sense Research Foundation, a 501c3, but our business model is essentially to take projects along, however long it takes, to a sufficient level of proof of concept such that we can actually get investors interested. So we can create a startup spin-out company that will attract venture capital, angel investment, and will take these things forward separately from us. This is an extremely effective way to go, simply because there's an awful lot of people out there with very deep pockets who just don't like giving money away. And even they may be comfortable with quite high risk, high reward investments, but only with investments. This has been an extremely welcome development over the past few years. It really only began 3 years ago or so that we started to get projects this far along, and certainly it'll be a while yet before the non-profit can kind of declare victory and say everything is being done, because there's plenty of projects that haven't yet got to that proof of concept, but we're definitely getting there. I thought I would just, for a few moments, give you a feel for the kind of work we do a little bit more technically, just to get to reassure you that I'm not completely bullshitting you. So this is one of the first papers that we published. What you're seeing here is a microscope photograph of the beginning of atherosclerosis. So you all know that atherosclerosis is the #1 killer in the Western world. It's the cause of heart attacks and strokes. And it begins like this. What happens is that white blood cells, called macrophages, go into the artery wall in the major arteries, and their purpose in doing that is to essentially clean up and recycle detritus that has become stuck there. And they're very, very good at doing this. That detritus is mainly composed of fatty acids and cholesterol, and they know what to do with that. But there are small, low concentrations of contaminants in that detritus, especially oxidized derivatives of cholesterol. And those derivatives, the macrophage doesn't know how to handle. So those derivatives accumulate. As I say, they're only present in low concentrations at first, but they accumulate, and eventually the macrophage starts to get unhappy with the amount of stuff like that. It sits in this part of the cell called the lysosome, and the lysosome stops working. And it fills up with stuff that it would normally be able to process. And that's an essential component of the normal recycling activity of the macrophage. So eventually the entire thing fills up with these globules of fat. It's a bit of a mess. And that's where atherosclerosis comes from. Therefore, without telling you any more, I've already told you the solution. The solution is simply to give these macrophages the ability to break down this oxidized cholesterol, or to recycle it in some other way. But yeah, break it down, shall we say. And that's what we were able to get macrophages to do. What we did was we looked in the soil, in the living world, for bacteria that were already able to break down oxidized cholesterol. We focused on this one particular type of oxidized cholesterol called 7-ketocholesterol, which happens to be the #1 most important one. And we found bacteria that could destroy it. Thank you. No, I've got my own. Thanks. And we found bacteria that could destroy it. Now, we're not going to inject those bacteria into the body. What we want to do instead is figure out how the bacteria destroy it. And that means, what genes they have that make enzymes that break it down. We were able to do that. That was quite easy. The hard part was the next step, which is to modify those enzymes so that you can put them into a human cell and they still work. Human cells, their internal structure is very different from bacteria. But eventually we got it working, and this is the result. Without going into too much detail, what you have here is a variety of concentrations of this toxic molecule, which are given to these cells. And the right-hand bar, as you can see, is always the tallest one out of the group of bars. What that says is that the cells which have this engineered, modified version of the bacterial enzyme are protected from the toxin relative to the negative controls, these other ones here, which are like cells that don't have an enzyme, or they have the wrong enzyme, or they have the right enzyme, but it hasn't been re-engineered to go to the right part of the cell, things like that. So yeah, this was very heartening. It was a sufficient proof of concept that one of our donors decided to become an investor. And he basically took the project off our hands, created a company, gave us 10% of the company, and ran with it. And that's going to be in clinical trials next year, probably. So this is the kind of thing we do. As I say, we have become quite well accepted. A long time ago, I couldn't have shown you this slide because a lot of people thought that I was crazy. But these days, scientists generally understand that this damage repair approach has a lot of legs. And this is our research advisory board, 30 of the world's most leading scientists with expertise covering the entire range of things that we're interested in developing. And they all, very strongly endorse what we do. Better than that, people have started reinventing this idea and pretending it's original. So this is a paper that came out in the year 2013, 5 years ago. It was published by a bunch of European grandees in gerontology, and it's a complete recapitulation of the concept I've told you about today. They split aging into 9 categories rather than 7, but that's not because they found new types of damage. It's just it's a slightly different way of doing the taxonomy. And they had their own, corresponding fixes. Completely the same idea. And what's important about this paper is, of course, I would like to get a little bit more of the credit, but the thing that matters the most is that this paper is not being ignored. This will be, by a long distance, the single most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging this decade. It's already been cited more than 2,000 times. So, a big deal. So I'm going to basically conclude my scientific remarks there and start talking about advocacy and terminology and what you guys ought to be out there doing. First thing I want to say is to come back to what I said at the beginning about my surprise in seeing the word death as something that you guys are not in favor of. Because I get called the prophet of immortality and things like that quite a lot. In fact, that was the title of the first big profile that was done on me in the mainstream media back in probably 2005. I think if you look at the concordance in the Bible, then the words prophet and immortality probably come higher than the words the and of. So, it must be quite fairly close anyway. I don't like that. I don't want to be depicted that way because it makes most people think that this is not technology. The word immortality is taken. You guys have got it, right? And we don't do that. I do medicine. That's what I do. I'm interested in keeping people healthy. Now, that's exactly what medicine has always been. And so quite often, I have come across religious people who will say, well, I'm not terribly in favor of all this. It seems to be in some way, disrupting God's plan for how long we ought to live. Now, I've got two problems with that logic. My first problem is, last I heard, God was supposed to be omnipotent, which means that, he really ought to be able to strike you down with a thunderbolt however healthy you are, right? Really. But the second problem I have is that aging doesn't just kill you. It kills you slowly. After, there's this long, extended, ghastly period of decrepitude and disease and dependence and debilitation and general misery, following which you die. That sounds like the kind of thing that the Bible tells us we ought to be kind of fixing, if we possibly can. It's bleeding obvious to me that from a Christian perspective, or indeed from the perspective of any other religion, that it would be a cardinal sin not to work on defeating aging. So when I talk to religious people and they say, disrupting God's plan, I go in hard. I don't say, no, it's okay. I don't do any of that. I go in hard and I say, look, you're fucking sinning not doing this. Right. This is something that I think it's important for people like you who obviously get the general idea that technology is a good thing and medicine in particular is a good thing. You need to be taking this on board. And I think specifically that you guys could play a really important part in this whole crusade. At the end of the day, my job is not to end aging, but to end aging sooner than it would otherwise end. Everybody knows that, if you think about it remotely rationally, that aging is a medical problem and eventually we'll solve it. The question is, how eventually? And I care about the fact that 100,000 people, about 110,000 now actually, die every day from aging. That's more than 70% of all deaths worldwide. Of course, in the industrialized world, it's closer to 90%. But, there is no country in the world at this point that has a life expectancy lower than 50. No country outside of sub-Saharan Africa that has a life expectancy lower than 60. Which means that aging is not just a first world problem at all. Aging is a global problem. It's the biggest health problem, and therefore, because health is the biggest suffering problem, aging is the biggest suffering problem, right? So, it's got to be fixed. And I don't care which 100,000. What gets me out of bed in the morning is not thinking I can improve by some tiny increment my probability of making the cut. What gets me out of bed in the morning is my knowledge that every day that I bring forward the defeat of aging, I'm saving the equivalent of 30 fucking World Trade Centers. It's easy to get out of bed for that. That's how I want you guys to be thinking too. And, when I speak in this way, I'm appealing to logic here, and I guess, most of you are technical types, you get how to understand a logical argument, but it's very tough getting through to most people that way. They've got their instinctive ideas about what they think, and they don't really know why they think it, and it's really quite hard to persuade people to think differently from how they normally do. But it's extraordinarily valuable. You don't have to persuade everybody. I'm not the first person to observe that converts are the most useful and the most energetic advocates of a particular position. People who used to think the opposite are the most energetic types. So you only have to fix this for a few people, and we've got some serious ammunition, some serious armamentarium. So this is what I want people like you to go out and do. It turns out that you would not be the first, by any means. There are a few people out there who come from a strong Christian tradition of one kind or another, and who have already been very active in this area. Sense Research Foundation actually grew out of a precursor foundation called the Methuselah Foundation, which was set up by myself and a businessman from Virginia back in 2002. And that guy, David Goebel is his name, he is a Jehovah's Witness. He, in fact, was an elder in the Jehovah's Witnesses organization, which is, obviously pretty high up, and he quit that in order to spend time on this. He has had one hell of a life since then, because, there's an awful lot of not terribly bright people in his community who just refuse to listen to the logic of the sort that I've just been giving you, even though he can give it to them in language that they ought to be able to understand. In fact, on 3 separate occasions during the time that he and I worked closely together, which was about a decade, he came within a hair of having to quit in order to save his marriage, because his wife couldn't handle it. It wasn't that she couldn't handle the logic. She's smart too, and she could get it. But she cared a lot more about the fact that their church community couldn't handle it, and she felt that he was an embarrassment. They worked through it, but it was hard. So I feel your pain, is what I'm saying. I understand very strongly that it's very hard to go out there in your own community and give this message. It's easy coming here and talking to each other, when you're all on the same side, but going out and talking to people who inherently feel that we shouldn't fuck with aging because it's normal, right? That's hard. And I want you to grit your teeth and damn well do it, because it will reap dividends. We will be able to make a difference. And the fact is, Christians, the Christian church, or churches in general, are extremely good at advocacy. You wouldn't exist so long otherwise. You know how to do this advocacy thing. So, once we get a critical mass of religious people actually getting this and going out there and really saying it loudly, then, public policy is going to change fast. And that, of course, means that money is going to come into this fast. And I cannot overemphasize how important that is. At this point, I believe that we could be going at least 3 times faster in terms of the research if there were even one more digit on the budget of the kind of money that's being spent in this area. We have a pitiful budget. We have a total of $5 million, not billion, million dollars per year to spend. 5 million, is that pathetic or what? And, we spend it very well, but, 3 times faster. That's one hell of a lot of lives that we could save. So I want more religious people to be out there advocating for this, because religious people tend to be quite good at advocating when they get their mind to it. Right. All right, I will stop there, because I think I want to leave at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I believe that's what we have. So let's talk. Oh, before anything else, I will mention that I wrote this book, some time ago. It's quite good. And this is my email address. And all right, go. Hands up, anyone? Yep. Wait for the microphone. I think they want to record stuff.
So, great presentation. I appreciate it. A couple months ago, I visited an organization in Arizona called Alcor that does cryonics. I don't know if you are familiar with them
I
at
know
all.
very well. I've been on their scientific advisory board for 15
well, I was
years.
going to ask you, what do you think of them, and what's your opinion of it? But it sounds
I
like...
think that, okay, so hands up anyone who doesn't know what cryonics is. That's very good news. Okay, I like it. A single hand went up. So yeah, I'm a very strong proponent of cryonics. I think that it is shameful that we have failed to educate the world in understanding the value of cryonics. But, of course, the reasons why we have failed are very similar to the reasons why I have so much difficulties with, helping people to understand the value of keeping people alive who are unequivocally still alive. The problem ultimately is psychological. My problem is that people have made their peace with aging, and when you've made your peace with something that's really horrible, the last thing you want to do is think about it ever again. So there are all manner of ways that people have invented to kind of trick themselves into believing that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise. Some people, of course, would say that the whole of religion is one of those tricks, but I won't go there. The point is here that with cryonics, it's more or less the same kind of deal. What we have done is convinced ourselves that there is this instantaneous phenomenon called death. And you go from being entirely alive to being entirely dead just like that. Biologically, that makes completely no sense, and all biologists know this, that, in fact, death is a process. When your heart stops beating and oxygen starts not getting to your various organs, then you start to accumulate damage of the sort I've spoken about rather more rapidly than you were accumulating it before, but still only at a finite rate. Therefore, if you were to arrest that accumulation of damage by, of course, lowering someone to liquid nitrogen temperatures, and you were to do that only just after they had been declared legally dead, then the fact is they're only slightly more damaged than they were before they were declared legally dead. And therefore it is perfectly reasonable to suppose that in the future we would be able to repair damage better and get them back to full health. Now, the next step in understanding the promise of cryonics is, of course, the question of whether the damage done by the cryopreservation process itself might exceed the damage that had already happened that caused the person to be declared legally dead in the first place. And certainly in simple cryopreservation, where you just stick someone in liquid nitrogen, that is the case. The amount of damage that's done is completely phenomenal. And there's no way in the world that such people are going to be revived by just warming them up. They would only be revived by some kind of uploading approach. However, that's changing. 20 years ago, the main problem, which is crystallization and the damage caused by that, was completely fixed by the development of an elaborate cocktail of cryoprotectants that cause solidification to happen in a manner that forms a glass rather than an actual crystalline solid. And then more recently, there is work being done by, which has succeeded now, I think, by a company that actually is one of our spin-outs. It's run by someone who used to be our chief operating officer. And it is solving the problem of cryoprotectant toxicity and also the problem of large-scale fracturing that happens during freezing on account of thermal stresses. So I believe that we are within a stone's throw of getting to the point where cryopreserved people will be potentially revivable just by warming them up.
Which company is the latter?
It's called Arigos, A-R-I-G-O-S. It's based in San Jose, and I'm perfectly happy to put anyone in touch with them who's interested, especially if you're interested in helping them financially.
I just had a question.
Take your microphone.
What anti-aging therapies are you taking yourself?
I don't, for two reasons. Number one, there aren't any that work. And number two, I'm lucky. I am well built. I've had my biological age or something akin to it measured on a number of occasions over the past 15 years or so, and I always come out ridiculously young for my actual age. So, it's a kind of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. I'm just lucky. Guy with a beard that's almost as impressive as anyway.
In one of your charts, you say sense focus on maintenance instead of metabolism. comparing to the car, right? That we can extend the life of the car.
Right.
But isn't the reason we can extend the life of the car because we built it from scratch and we know how it works?
No. The reason why a Land Rover lasts longer than a typical car is that. It's because a Land Rover is designed to last unusually long time. And they don't last 100 years, but they maybe last 50 years with only the regular amount of maintenance. But the reason why vintage cars like this last a long time is not because that was how they were designed. They were designed to last maybe 10 years, 15 years at the outside, and yet here they still are. And the key thing about maintenance is that, the parallel would be, the metabolism approach would be understanding the chemistry of rusting and, somehow treating your car in a way that stopped it rusting. So that's one thing. And of course, Land Rovers, galvanized steel and all that. But we don't do that. And yet, still, the cars are all right. Yep. Wait for the microphone.
Given the successes with the Senolytics, am I saying that right? The Ocean Biotechnology,
Senolytics, yeah.
Senolytics, and the stem cell work, even that you've been working on with Ajax, do you believe that the first round of rejuvenation therapies could use just those two items, or do you think they would have to wait for approaches to all seven?
This is something where I have become gradually more optimistic over the past few years. So prior to the original work that led to Unity Biotechnology and the Senolytic revolution, my view was that senescent cells, they were definitely one of my categories, but they would not play all that big a role in the overall grand scheme of aging. In particular, if we just fix that and nothing else, we'd fix some, maybe the immune system would be better. That was the particular example that I was focusing on. But it was fairly unlikely that there would be a widespread big effect. And it seems that that may not be the case. For sure, it seems even if you start with normal mice, which of course was not done in the original experiments back in 2011, that there is a significant effect, quite widespread across many aspects of aging. What this tells us, obviously there was always going to be some degree of interaction between the 7 strands. If you fix one, you're going to improve the pre-existing damage repair machinery that slows down the others. But the degree, the magnitude of that interaction was completely unclear. And I think it may be more than I was estimating, which is, of course, fantastic news, because, as you say, what we could get away with in that case, we might reach longevity, escape velocity, by only fixing less than 7 of them. Now, I don't want to get my hopes up. I have enough of a hard time as it is not getting other people's hopes up. And, there's a huge amount of uncertainty still. But for sure, we will be incrementally combining these various things as they come on stream, of course, first in the lab and eventually in the clinic. And we just have to hope for the best, and we'll keep going until we get that. As I said, I don't care which 100,000 lives I save each time, really. It's just a matter of keeping going as best we can. Yep.
So 2 questions. You consider yourself fortunate in terms of your health. Are you eating something different or not different, exercise? And then the second question is, how many spin-out companies have come, and what kind of investments come with it?
So the first question, I don't actually do anything, really. I don't eat particularly unusually. I don't exercise much. I'm just lucky. Spin-outs. So far, we've spun out 5 companies from the foundation. We've got another one coming in the next month or 2. And it's not just the spin-outs from us. The companies that we advocate and that we connect with investors include plenty of companies that sprang up independently of us, but closely aligned, people we talk to a lot. So it's definitely a real industry now. Now, almost all of these companies are still small. They're still, seed round, Series A round, kind of, 7 or 8 digit valuation. Unity Biotechnology, which is the poster child of the Senolytic revolution, is the real big daddy of them all right now. It's got a valuation in the region of $1 billion, but there will be quite a few other companies in that kind of range fairly soon. Yep.
What's your general take on other people's maybe idea of the future of health and extending longevity, like Ray Kurzweil's transferring the mind into computer?
Well, let me answer that in the context of what I was saying about advocacy. And actually, what I'm going to do is start by talking about the word transhumanism. I was actually the first recipient of the H.G. Wells Award, which is the thing that the World Transhumanist Association, which I think is now called Humanity Plus, gives away each year for, I think they call it for outstanding contributions to transhumanism or something like that. That was back in 2004, and I was a little bit embarrassed already at being labelled a transhumanist, because I really don't like to think of myself that way. But again, this is this case of, you hear what you want to hear in words. And this came up earlier today as well, how, whether you think that transhumanism is a good thing or not is kind of linked to how you use the word human. Do you use the word human to define humans of the present, or do you use it to define human potential? I think if you use it to define human potential, then you don't want to think about the idea of creating something that's no longer human, right? Because being human is good, whereas conversely, etc. Therefore, I like to stay away from all of that. I like to try to emphasize the continuity between what I do and the things that people are already unambiguously comfortable with, like medical research. So when it comes to uploading or whatever, personally, I'm a little bit conservative. In the same way that with cryonics, I would definitely prefer, if I have to be frozen at all, that I get reanimated by being warmed up rather than by being uploaded. Similarly, I don't really see much attraction myself in transfer to a different substrate as a way of moving forward. But I'll take it if that's all. If I don't have a choice, right? So I don't have strong feelings about it. And there's a few more. Okay, yeah, guy with the 3 stars on his chest.
Thank you. What gives value, and not just any kind of value, not instrumental value, but what gives intrinsic value to life and therefore aging and therefore your research?
Yeah, great question. I haven't the faintest idea. Actually, this is quite an important thing. There's a wonderful Louis C.K. sketch about kids that won't stop saying why. You've got to look it up. It's just breathtakingly wonderful. It's like, I think at some point one has to have some kind of sense of, contentment with a certain set of things being axiomatic. I do not know why I want to dedicate my life to improving people's quality of life. I have known that that is what I want to do since I was very young, as I mentioned earlier on. But why I am that kind of person, I haven't the faintest idea. And I'm completely comfortable with the fact that I haven't the faintest idea. Guy behind you. Behind you. You just give me the microphone behind you. Yeah.
So you made a distinction between the body being mechanistic, but you didn't say the being.
Correct, yeah. What I'm saying is this is one of those things that I don't need to know.
Well, what evidence do we have that consciousness is restorable if we warm somebody up?
Okay. And in the context of cryonics, yes, very good one. Okay, so, well, of course we don't have direct evidence because it hasn't been done. But what we certainly do have is plenty of evidence that consciousness is restorable from a point that is beyond what we currently call legal death. There are quite a lot of people out there who have been declared legally dead and who are walking around fully functional. So that's the best we can say right now, that that we don't know what death is, therefore we don't know when someone's actually dead. All we do know is, operationally, if someone is not dead today, then they have never been dead, right? And therefore, if we thought they were, we were wrong.
So let's say, hypothetical scenario, your work follows through and next month we have cured aging. In solving one problem, we have a host of new problems, like easy ones, population overpopulation.
Yeah, that's a really easy one.
Energy, the environment. Like, do we start sterilizing people, saying who can reproduce and who can't, and what do we do with all these other problems?
All right, so...
sorry to be practical here.
So, of course, it's not exactly the first time the solving of a problem that humanity has gives rise to new problems that didn't exist before. And we're kind of okay with that. The Industrial Revolution was a bit turbulent, but most people tend to think back in hindsight, it was probably quite a good thing. in this case, of course, yes, we have the great advantage here that we're seeing it coming. You know, we've got plenty of time to figure out how to minimize the turbulence, minimize the magnitude of any problems that might come along. Luckily, a lot of these problems are actually so easy to solve that we probably won't even need to try. So let's take the overpopulation one. You know, what is overpopulation? It's not defined by the number of people on the planet. It's defined by the amount of pollution generated by the number of people on the planet. In other words, the better we get at living more cleanly, the more people we can have on the planet without an unacceptable amount of environmental impact. As of today, we obviously have an overpopulation problem. That's why we have climate change. And therefore, one might think that we would have a problem if we had more people, a bigger problem. But only if we don't figure out how to do, for example, renewable energy and artificial meat and, you know, desalination and all the obvious things. And, of course, those things are already happening. Better than that, they're not even happening because we care about climate change. They're happening because we're figuring out how to do solar energy more cheaply than fossil fuels and so on and so forth. And, you know, these things are all going to be completely in place and established way before we start to roll out therapies that allow people not to die. So, you know, I mean, the worst of it is, you see, I've actually been explaining this to people for a very long time in, you know, national media and so on all over the world, and nobody ever fucking remembers. You know, it's as if nobody wants to hear the answer to these questions. This is part of what I was saying earlier about wanting to put this thing out of your mind and being desperate not to get your hopes up, you know, wanting to carry on making your peace with all of this.
You've said that the person to live to be 500 is already alive, and probably, I'm maybe misquoting this, 60, based on the 60 years old now, based on the progress and the pace at which your research and others, you know, in this field, research is going. Do you still think so?
Yes.
Do you have adjustments to make the prediction?
Not much. So the first time I started giving predictions in this area was about 15 years ago, about 03, 04. And I said that I thought it was going to be about 25 years before we reached the development of the things I mentioned on that table, which is kind of what you might call Sense 1.0, the first generation rejuvenation therapies. Now, I believe that that will be sufficient to reach what I've called longevity escape velocity, in other words, to rejuvenate people well enough that the improvements that will happen thereafter to the comprehensiveness of these therapies will outpace the increase in the difficulty of the problem of keeping people alive progressively longer, so that we will continue to be able indefinitely to keep the level of damage in the body down below the level that causes pathologies. So in other words, basically, the only real question is that 25-year estimate correct? If it was back then that would mean that people who had, let's say, 10 or 15 years of life left in them, they were not at death's door yet, you know, okay, could be treated by these therapies and would have a good chance of living to 1,000 or more. And so if it was going to be 25 years, then you're definitely talking about people who were, let's say, you know, let's say 70 on average at that time. And of course, some people live maybe 30 years longer than the average. So those are people who could be maybe even 90 at that time. So people who would therefore be 65 at the point that I made the prediction. Now, as of today, 15 years later, my time frame has only come down by 5 years, which is a bit of a shame. I did mention the factor of 3 earlier on in terms of how fast we could go. The good news is that pessimism, no, that over-optimism on my part is entirely with regard to the money. We haven't had any bad news, you know, new discoveries on the science that have led us to be more pessimistic. It's purely the fact that we haven't been able to bring in the money as fast as I was hoping. But still, that means that today, you know, the first person to live to 1,000 is probably 65 or maybe even 70. The first cohort, you know, people born in a given year, that will on average live to that kind of age is probably 30 or 40. So, yeah. Who hasn't asked a question yet? You haven't? The guy with the beard next to the camera.
So you had a list of probably 7 biological things that go wrong as we age.
Exactly 7, in fact.
You know, runaway cell division, stuff like that. I'm a scientist. So as a scientist and as a researcher, which one of those areas are you most excited about?
Well,
which area is going to be the most fruitful?
excitement is the wrong word to use because, of course, because I'm a scientist and I'm at the coalface of all of this, I'm watching all of this all the time and I'm helping to take it forward. And so even the tiniest little bit of progress here and there deep in the weeds that it would take me half an hour to explain the significance of, is exciting to me. But the key thing is we've got to fix all of these things. Every one of these things can kill you more or less on schedule, modulo the thing I was saying earlier about the interactions. Every one of them can kill you, even however well we fix all the others. So one can't get excited about any particular one. We do almost no work in stem cells, and that's because other people are doing all the useful work already. We do stuff that is being neglected, and that's because we need those things to catch up, because the ones that are neglected, of course, are the ones that are at an earlier stage of development. I guess I'm going to have to stop soon, but I'm going to leave it to Micah to tell me when. Rock and roll. Thank you.